disaster, Cabinet approved a recommendation by the National Coronavirus Command Council to further extend the national state of disaster to 15 January 2022 in terms of Section 27, subsection 5, paragraph C of the Disaster Management Act 2002, Act 57 of 2002. The national state of disaster is aimed at responding to the special circumstances presented by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Cabinet has extended for the 18th time now the national state of disaster until the 15th of January 2022. The first state of disaster was implemented in March 2020, and there have been mounting calls for Cabinet to end this. The Institute of Race Relations is one of the bodies that are calling for the end of the national disaster and writing to President Cyril Ramaphosa and wanting to know on what basis is this still necessary. Tonight, we unpack this topic with South African Medical Association Chairperson Dr. Angelique Coetzee, Institute of Race Relations Head of Campaigns Gabriel Kraus, and Anton Arnse, the Chief Operating Officer at Newzroom Group. You're a part of this conversation tonight. We ask the question, do you believe the state of national disaster is still the ideal vehicle through which government can curb the spread of the COVID-19 virus? 072-110-5584. You can tweet us tonight at Newzroom405. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much for your time. We'll be joined, I'm sure, a bit later on in the conversation by Dr. Angelique. But let's start here. The President as well as Cabinet approving the extension of South Africa's national state of disaster into 2022. However, government is now looking at ways to move away from the controversial system for good and answering some questions, saying that the various departments have been requested now to accelerate the phasing in of COVID resilience measures using their respective existing legislative framework. That's what the minister at COCTA has said. And Gabriel, let's start with you. I mean, one would say the immediate approach to respond to a health crisis, to a disaster, would have been to declare a state of national disaster. It's not the same as declaring an emergency, but however, it does give government a certain degree of unusual power to determine how to respond medically to the emergency. Was that the correct decision at the time?
So I think the decision in March 2020 to declare a state of disaster is defensible. It was a reasonable decision to make, and we at the Institute supported it at the time. But since then, at no stage have South Africans been permitted on a voluntary basis to leave their homes after midnight, as just one example of the extraordinary curtailment of our civil rights that has been implemented under this regime. When we first launched the petition and had our attorneys write to the presidency and the COCTA minister, South Africa had the lowest case and death records since the peak of the first wave. In October and November, there was clearly no disaster. And we said, you must therefore end it or explain why you're not ending it. If you then have a new variant, which was highly predictable, and you have a new wave, which was highly predictable, then you can reconsider your position and see whether or not you need to reinitiate the state of disaster. But if the question is, was it right or wrong to extend it in October and November, it was clearly wrong. Is it right now? Well, to answer that question, you have to ask whether you think lockdowns are effective. Yeah. The evidence that we're seeing is that in South Africa, unfortunately, they haven't been. And the other measures, for example, rolling out vaccines, beefing up hospitals, hardening our resilience, those measures can be taken through the ordinary legislative process. And for that reason, we think that the state of disaster is still defunct.
Yeah. The argument that is put forward, for example, would be that the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented and its potential impacts have yet to be fully understood. So we could have lifted the state of national disaster and boom, here we're with Omicron. Now we've got to put it back again. And that creates a degree of incoherency in policy because you've got to move between national state of disaster, not national state of disaster, national state of disaster. So until we are at a point where we know exactly how to live with this pandemic, this would be a good system in terms of risk management to be in place. You don't agree?
No, I don't. And we are almost the only country we're certainly the only country we'd like to compare ourselves with who have done things the way we've done them. Most countries have followed a risk-adjusted approach, and that means when times have been tough, extraordinary measures have been taken, and when times have relaxed, governments have repealed the extra judiciary, super legislative powers that the executive has been granted, and they've returned to parliamentary oversight. The basic point is that we're a constitutional democracy, and Parliament has had no effective oversight in the lockdown measures, in the National Coronavirus Command Council measures, for over 600 days. That's extraordinary. It's a derogation of our fundamental constitutional democracy. It means the watchdog of Parliament is not doing its job. And we want Parliament to return to its oversight position, where the Command Council has to explain, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? That is the best protection against banning open-toed shoes or cigarettes or alcohol or whatever measures may or may not be just, for them first to have to explain themselves and then put in the ban. Whereas right now the system we have is first they put in the ban and then they only have to explain themselves later,
right,
and only if people challenge them at court, which is very expensive. Most South Africans just can't afford to get the money together to go and pose a court challenge, and without doing that, we have no democratic means of holding the Command Council to account.
Dr.
It's
Angelique,
extraordinary on the international scope.
Joining us now as well. Good evening, and thank you very much for your time. The declaration of the national state of disaster means that government now can determine, for example, and manage supply chains, right? Particularly plan how to redeploy human and financial resources to the front line. Has that been effective?
Good evening. I think it's a much more complicated case and there's not a simple answer to this. So yes, it's true. It allows for a declaration of state of disaster, and it was proclaimed for the first 3 months of the lockdown, and thereafter the Disaster Management Act was renewed on a monthly basis, and which is understandable. It's not the ideal thing, but it's understandable. The problem, however, is that the current Health Act doesn't give enough powers to the authorities, especially in this case to the National Department of Health, regarding regulations, drafting of regulations. So the only way to circumvent these problems is by using the Disaster Management Act. And unfortunately for National Department of Health and other government departments, to draft new regulations to help and assist here, it means the Health Act must first be amended. And that would take nearly 2 years to get that amended. So for now, the Disaster Management Act helps us, because we are still in a pandemic. We're not out of this pandemic. And the gaps that is in our healthcare and other acts is actually now highlighted with this. But unfortunately, it needs to be, the act needs to be amended. So it's not that easy. And as I've said, we're still under a pandemic. We cannot just say, no, we should, cancel the Disaster Management Act. You cannot do that.
Yeah.
That is the only way that we can still help and assist.
The government saying that they have now asked relevant sector departments to accelerate the phasing in of COVID-19 resilient measures using their respective existing legislative framework. Now, if we just focus on the health department itself, the existing legislative framework, does it allow for that kind of resilience?
And unfortunately, it doesn't give enough powers for the minister to draft, especially under the infectious disease problems that we are now experiencing here. They cannot draft regulations because that regulations is not provided for in the Act. So again, the whole problem is, even if they want to draft regulations, the Health Act doesn't allow that. The Health Act first must be amended for this process to proceed. And because the Disaster Management Act is quite broad, for now we get away with some of these so-called regulations under that. But the correct way would be for the Act to be amended.
All right, Anton, let's bring you in. I mean, in fact, in as far as the global context, that Gabriel is raising of how other countries, for example, have handled this particular matter. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore, they have had a multifaceted action plan which include, for example, the assessment of the hazard and the vulnerability, the preparedness, and then the response, and then the recovery. Now, in implementing such a plan, do you think a national state of disaster is required to be in place?
Good evening, Thabo. Good to be on the show. To a largely degree, support what Gabriel is saying. The state of disaster has served its purpose, and it served its purpose well. But I also believe that it was, or it ought to have been, the intention that while the state of disaster was called out, that government would put measures in place to deal with the pandemic. Now, I'd like to further respond not from the aspect of legislation or regulatory frameworks, because quite frankly, we do not have the luxury of time. I think we know that under normal circumstances, it takes the better part of 2 to 3 years to develop legislation, let alone regulations. And who knows where this country will be if we actually follow that route. So really, we are needing to look at what government has done since instating the national state of disaster and for the continuous extension thereof. Most recently, I believe what's in vogue right now is the issue of vaccination mandate and mandatory vaccinations. Quite frankly, while we support the notion of a vaccine mandate, I also believe that there needs to be a far more nuanced conversation around whether people need to be vaccinated or not. At this point in time, we have a very simplistic view that people are either pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, whereas in reality, there is a significant portion of people in this country who actually do want to be vaccinated, but owing to government's very limited choice that they've made available to the citizenry, there in fact are a significant number of people who cannot be vaccinated. And Dr. Angelique would be able to probably expand on that, where people on the advice of their GPs have been advised not to be vaccinated. So do you call them anti-vaxxers? I don't believe so. Yeah. Now, all of this happens under the very, very almost simplistic and naive, very narrow understanding of a vaccine mandate. So really, just to conclude my initial point here, yes, the state of disaster, national state of disaster, was called out at the right time, but I believe that its purpose has been completely surpassed by not only global events, but also a failure for government to have a serious look at how its implementation strategy has unfolded and unrolled while continuing to extend this national state of disaster.
We'll come back to what you're raising there around the vaccine mandates, and I think a question, maybe Dr. Kitsia could help us here to understand whether or not that would require specific regulation to be put in place to allow for those who, via the note from their doctor, would be allowed, at least be exempt from that mandatory vaccination. But we'll get more details on that and get as well as Gabriel to respond to some of these issues.
The other issue that we are trying to think about carefully, that's why vaccination has become so important, is to live with this corona, because you need to find a balance between the livelihood and lives, because these are two sides of the same coin. If you don't strike a balance between the two, once the other one collapses, there's no life. There are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is life. When one of them collapses, the life collapses.
All right, back with you tonight, you're in Focus. Thanks for staying on. Dr. Angelique Coetzee, Gabriel Kraus, as well as Anton Arendse, my guests tonight. 072-110-5584. We're taking your views. Do you believe the national state of disaster is still the ideal vehicle for government to use to curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic? We hear that the minister in the presidency, Dr. Angelique Coetzee, he's saying that we've got to find a way to live with the virus. In other words, I don't know what the medical term is. I think it has to be endemic. Is that what it's supposed to be? So that we will find a way to continue to live with it. Are we at that point?
I think it's a very good question. Whether we are there yet, we're not sure. But the feeling is that it is going to become endemic if we look at the Omicron. But here the scientists will most probably be able to help us out better going forward. You know, if the new variants would more or less be the same as Omicron regarding mildness, although fast spreading, then I think we would be able to manage it much better going forward. And, you know, the simple measurements that should always be in place. You know, I think everyone has heard by now the masks and the social distancing and all of that. We will have to learn how to manage huge crowds, especially on sport, churches. How do we going to manage that going forward? We would also need to understand whether the vaccines would they only mostly protect us against severe disease. If that is indeed true, but you still get mild disease, then I think that would also not put a huge burden on the healthcare system. But there's a lot of unknowns that we don't know yet. And therefore, one of the problems is with the Disaster Management Act, we cannot for now just, you know, let it go and say, well, we're not going to have it going forward. There's still too much uncertainty. But endemic, I'm quite sure that is the way forward. And vaccines, regarding vaccines and mandatory, I know there's this question is actually breaking up families. I have seen that. I have seen between should you only vax and not vax. I've seen the impact of that on families. The truth is, if we want to get herd immunity, if we want to stay out of hospitals with severe disease, unfortunately, the vaccines will be the way to go. And mandatory vaccines, if you work in any public-facing environment like a medical doctor seeing patients, you're actually supposed to be mandatory vaccinated, because you also pose a risk if you don't vaccinate and you are spreading the virus to all your patients coming in that's not vaccinated. So there should be some accountability under healthcare workers regarding mandatory vaccines. And yes, I know that is there a gap?
Is there a gap there? Sorry, Dr. Coetzee. Is there a gap there as far as legislation is concerned? The Health Act, does it say that explicitly?
So there's other acts that come into play here. And a lot of people are using that to say yes, but it's my human right. But there's an act that says in a pandemic, the health of the nation is higher than your own personal health. I'm now saying it in a very layman's term, but in the end of the day, yes, they can. And I think it's going to be tested now in the Concord, if I'm not mistaken, by, you know, with mandatory by some of the unions as well as one of the departments. I know there's a case going on currently to see what would be the outcomes. And if the outcomes is in favor of mandatory vaccination, then it's going to be much more difficult for people not to vaccinate, especially if you're public facing.
Yeah. Gabriel, I mean, we are at a point where we need to determine whether the need to augment existing legislation and contingency arrangements through the Disaster Management Act regulation is no longer required. From Dr. Coetzee, we get a sense that there are still gaps. We are not there yet. If we put that out, as Anton says, we might need to be putting new laws every 2 years. I mean, what would happen if we have a 2-year lag in putting a law in place?
Look, firstly, Parliament can move much more quickly than it has traditionally moved, and governments around the world have shown this, where they usually take 2 years. When they've had to be quick for this, they've been quick. Secondly, the good doctor in the previous segment was asked twice whether the current normal legislation is not good enough, and she said, no, it's not good enough, we need the Disaster Management Act, without giving a single example of why that is. Thirdly, in terms of vaccine mandates, the Institute of Race Relations has launched a petition against mandatory vaccines. We encourage people to be vaccinated, especially those who are vulnerable, who've never been previously infected. We think if businesses want to say, you can't come here or you can't work here unless you've been vaccinated, that's freedom of association. We respect that. But when it comes to the government stepping in saying, you have to be vaccinated, otherwise we'll take away your SASSA grants, or otherwise we will use the police power against you, we're absolutely against that and looking to join any court application in that regard. One of the biggest missing bits of information, the good doctor was referring to the gaps in our knowledge, which I think are very serious, is how many people have already been infected and recovered. Now, every study that I've come across has shown that convalescent protection is at least as strong as vaccine protection. Discovery estimated that by mid-August in 2021, up to 80% of South Africans had already been infected. People who've already been infected might be extra reluctant to get vaccinated, and they might in any event be quite well protected, at least as well protected as the ordinary vaccinated person. Our government or our private sector should be conducting widespread random serological studies, going out, doing antigen tests, seeing, have you had it before without realizing it, or you realized it, but you didn't actually go to a doctor or clinic because it was far away, so your case was never recorded, and have you recovered? That's important information to understand in terms of Omicron. Is it mild because it's actually mild, or is it mild because the people that it's infecting have already previously been infected, so they can get infected twice, but the second time their body is much stronger, so they're much less likely to be hospitalized or to die? Has the Omicron virus mutated in the way that it did, precisely because South Africa had such high levels of convalescent protection? And remember that the United Kingdom has the opposite ratio to us of vaccines to convalescence. But if you add it together, it looks like it's the same, if Discovery estimates are right. And in the UK, they had Freedom Day since August. Yeah. That means no restrictions. And what happened? Their caseload was 3 times higher than ours now. It was very, very high, consistently for the rest of the year. But the death numbers were extremely low. Why? Because the vaccines helped and the convalescence helped. We might be in a similar position. And there's a lot of doctors in the UK, or professors, who are describing them as already having achieved endemic status. Yeah. And that's part of the reason they've been able to return to democratic norms. So what I want is for our scientists to go out there and test people to see, have you already had it? Yeah. And then we will gain that information. If it's very low, then you can encourage people. You can say, you think you're fine because you think you've had it, but you haven't had it, so get vaccinated. Yeah. So whatever the outcome is, we can work with it. But as long as we don't know, we're sitting in an awkward position where we might force people to be vaccinated who've already recovered with very little marginal benefits.
I know Dr. Kuzia wants to jump in, but let me quickly get Anton to come in here. I know you've worked with Sinovac, partnering with them, especially around trials and coming up with the vaccines. What have you found around the vaccinated and the convalescents?
Yeah, look, I mean, just given the nature of trials, one needs to maintain the integrity of those sessions, of those trials, and so not able to necessarily disclose the details of the current trial. But what we can say is that previous trials run, and particularly among pediatrics, the results have actually been very good. To the extent that a good few number of people below the ages of 18 have already been vaccinated outside of South Africa. Again, forgive me if this becomes my soapbox for the session, we are not going to attain herd immunity in South Africa unless we actually go below the ages of 18. And at this point in time, again, we are limited to the range of vaccines that are available in this country. Again, I would leave it to the good doctor to talk to us about myocarditis. And the reality here at Thabo, we find ourselves with a situation where if you know you have a heart disease, and you know that you cannot make use of the vaccines available in this country, what choices do you have? There are none. Really, we need to kind of move beyond this point of suggesting that everybody needs to get vaccinated. It's the one thing that we all agree on, that no one will be safe until everyone is jabbed. It's the one aspect that we all agree on, but where that probably is the point of divergence as well, where we as a country, we've placed our eggs in one or two baskets, and the result has been inevitable. We find ourselves in a situation that we could have forecast 3, 4, 5 months ago. We would find ourselves in this situation. Another aspect, Tabu, which we ought to have covered in the previous segment, one of the things that the Disaster Management Act allows government to do is deviate or divert from well-established procurement measures.
Yes.
What that has enabled government to do is look at a very, very specific group and category of vaccines at the expense of others. And forgive my saying so, and obviously I declare and you've indicated my interest. But this is not about Sinovac. This is not about Sputnik. This is not about Sinopharm. This is about attaining herd immunity for South Africa. People are dying. People's livelihoods are being affected. The economy was already on the downward spiral prior to COVID-19, and there's very little signs of recovery. A lot of this can be ascribed to our inability as a nation to get ourselves vaccinated, to relieve ourselves from the rigorous lockdown measures, amongst others.
And let me just come in here because we've got to take a break. But
an economy that is working.
But you're saying that is largely because of a lack of choice as well, contributing to the low numbers. We'll touch that a little bit further when we come back. Dr. Angelique Kutsia, Gabriel Kraus, as well as Anton Arends here with us tonight. We asked the question, do you think that the disaster management regulation is still the correct vehicle, or is it no longer required to assist us and protect the public? What are your thoughts? 072-110-5584. Otherwise, you can tweet us at Newzroom405. In Focus continues next. right, In Focus continues with our conversation tonight. Do you believe the state of disaster is still the ideal tool to protect the public from the COVID-19 virus, or have we reached a point where it is no longer required? What are your thoughts? Tweet us at Newzroom 405, or otherwise call us 072-110-5584. We'll take you live with your views tonight. All right, Dr. Kutsia, there's a lot to respond to there. For coming from that last segment. So one is of course the questions that are being raised around those who have already, a large number who've already got infected and have now come over the other side of the virus and have built natural immunity, and of course those who are being vaccinated, and whether or not a combination of both could certainly help us in the fight against this virus. And then, of course, there's this big question around the choice and the availability of various vaccines. What's your view?
Thank you so much. I want to thank Anton. He actually answered Gabriel some of the questions around what was the gaps in that we are seeing that I didn't allude to. Thank you, Anton, for that. And again, it's around infectious diseases and how to write regulations around that, which is not in place. Remember, we never had a pandemic of this magnitude before. And again, yes, our acts are not always correct, and it's not always speaking in the language to address what is actually been happening. But you will only know once if you are confronted like we are now. And yes, it would be good if Parliament can change the Health Act in less than 2 years, but I doubt whether that would happen. Come back to immunity. One of the problems is, and yes, it would be a very nice study to see how many antibodies is out there, how many T-cell immunity is there as well. But this is unfortunately the T-cell to go out and do random testing and trials on that is not so simple. And again, who's going to pay for that? Who would benefit from getting that? I know we will benefit for the data, but I don't think that's going to happen. This is a topic that's been quite, discussed quite a few times, because everyone wants to know that. And remember, on your normal immunity, your antibodies, unfortunately with Delta, we have seen that your IgG becomes positive quite quickly or early in the disease. When normally it would take about 6 months, so that's not even going to help us. Then what we have also seen is that yes, the efficacy of the vaccines are waning as time passes. But does it affect our T-cell immunity? That's a very important question, because your T-cell immunity helps, especially when with the cytokine storm later on in your disease progression. And if you have good T cells, then you would be able to fight much better. But it's difficult to determine them. It's not that easy. So to come back to herd immunity, also we have the blood bank who said that I think there was 75% of their people that had antibodies. But again, we don't know how long these IgG is going to stay positive. And again, it doesn't really measure the T-cell immunity. If you then look at the vaccines that's out there, for now, the best your best bet would be to have natural immunity and then get a vaccine. And that boosts the immunity quite, that gives a very, very good booster effect on the immunity. We know that your own immunity, natural immunity, also wanes over time. So because this is it's not here for 2 or 3 years, this disease, as I've said, there's a lot of unknowns. And regarding vaccines, yes, it is true that we only have an mRNA and then the DNA vector vaccine. Unfortunately, this is what we have. Even if you bring other vaccines in, you need to start looking at maybe heterologous boosting of the immune systems for people. There's very good data on that. but only, first of all, finish your boost, your normal dose. If you need to get 2 Pfizer doses, then you finish your Pfizer doses, and then look at, should you heterologous boost with Johnson & Johnson, or should Johnson & Johnson actually be a 2-dose, and then with a booster, should you get Pfizer? And yes, there should be another kit on the block, another vaccine to help those that can't take any of these two. Yes, it is also true that children are the spreaders of the viruses. Hopefully, as we carry it going on forward, that the spreading of the viruses, as the children get more immunity against these viruses, will be less, transmissible. And at some stage, let's look at what other countries are doing with vaccines for young children.
Yeah.
For now, it's not on our cards. We're still struggling to get the 12 years and up to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether I answered all the questions.
It's quite a lot, yeah. It's quite a lot there. Let's go back to you then, Gabriel. I mean, one of the targeted approaches around the response during the state national disaster is to be able to target the vulnerable urban population who needs support, and as well as to be able to target to expand the social safety net in as far as programs are concerned. Now, if you don't have the national state of disaster in place, for example, you can't be able to tap into intergovernmental fiscal transfers of monies, because under normal regulation that does not happen.
Okay, so from the money side, it is the case that some of the intergovernmental transfers and some of the procurement supply chain management procedures are more lax. This is also cause for concern. So just to be clear, under standard practice with no command council, there is still a difference between regular procurement and emergency procedure procurement. That can speed things up very much. What we have right now is, on top of that, this extra layer of opacity, this extra layer of, we're going to go so quickly and you don't have to look at how our tender process is working, so don't worry about it. The upshot of that has been not only the digital vibe scandal, but various egregious offenses, I think, to ordinary South Africans. And I completely agree with Anton. The fact that we only have, that ordinary South Africans outside of the Sisonke trial only have one choice of what kind of vaccine to get doesn't make sense on two fronts. The one front, and this only happens because we have this extraordinary overreach in terms of government regulation. The one way it doesn't make sense is scientifically. We know the difference in T-cell and antibody responses. We know that some vaccines promote a stronger T-cell response, some promote a stronger antibody response. We know from at least laboratory studies that if you go from the one to the other, it can have a better effect than if you just stick with the same one, if you're completing your dosage properly, as was said. We also know from a political perspective, from a human choice perspective, that even if you put the science to one side, many people would rather have Pepsi than Coke, or Fanta than Sparletta. People like the idea of making their own choice. And if you give more options, some of the people who don't like this choice, even if it's for a bad reason or a superficial reason, will then at least have the choice to get another option. And that would increase the vaccination rates. So both scientifically and just in terms of basic market analysis, if there was less of a circumvention of the usual market forces that come to bear and the usual approval processes coming out of SAPA, things would be much better off. And let me just finish out by saying the Institute of Race Relations was basically alone in civil society lobbying the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority to say you must allow people to get boosters. Outside of Sisonke, people could not get boosters even while Omicron was blowing up. We said if people's doctors and them are consulting together and they're saying now is the time for a booster, you must allow that. And it took 2 weeks, and we are very glad that the SAPA CEO responded to us. And then they did allow those boosters to come into play, but then they said only if you got vaccinated more than 6 months ago. Well, if someone's doctor is saying for various particular reasons, you were vaccinated 5 months ago, but right now is the time to get boosted, that should also be allowed. Right now, all of the allowance for government to do whatever it wants to do, we think government is like Superman coming with a cape. If you just untether it from the procedures of democracy, of constitutional parliamentary norms, and of individuals making their own choices, then the day will be saved. But we can see in South Africa that's not happened. We have 27 million people on social grants. We have at least 2 million extra unemployed. We have age-adjusted, one of the worst death rates from COVID. And if 80% of people were infected, as Discovery estimated, we also had the worst spread in the world of COVID. So we've lost on all of these measures when we were trusting government completely. Yeah. My argument is we should trust the people, give them more choice, give them the freedom to choose, and then we will see better results.
Right, we'll come back and touch a little bit more on the other issues as well. Dr. Angelique Coetzee, Gabriel Kraus and Anton Arendse taking your views tonight on 072-110-5584. That should we move away from the Disaster Management Act, this now having been extended at least for the 18th time. It's been in place since March 2020, and the next round now continues up until January the 15th, 2022. That's a conversation we have been having tonight. Let's hear your views on 072-110-5584, or otherwise you can tweet us at Newzroom405. Dr. Angelique Coetzee, Gabriel Kraus, as well as Anton Arendse with us tonight. So, Anton, are you convinced that the reason why we have limited choice it is because of the state of national disaster, or is it just purely stringent requirements from SAPRA that prevent more players from coming in?
I think Gabriel was far too polite in his earlier response. I would put it to you very simply, and just to draw an analogy from our very recent history and the state of emergency. You know, there was a time when intentions were honorable, and I believe that in this instance, similarly, I would be a lot more harsher in indicating that it is this very piece of legislation that has occasioned us, that we find ourselves in the situation that we do, where government has used this legislation and have used these regulations, in fact, to achieve a very specific political and socio-economic ends. And so, yes, the answer absolutely is yes. It is my view that the national state of disaster, and specifically the relaxation of procurement measures, have occasioned that, coupled, as you correctly indicate, the regulator and how all of these institutions have been used in a specific way to attain very specific ends. Again, just to draw from, I come from a time where we were prescribed to use a specific language in our primary and our high schools. And that goes back to, I think it's the 70s and the 80s. We saw the outcome thereof. You only need to look at what's happening in Europe right now, where there are public protests around people being forcibly being told to vaccinate without the option of choosing either not to. But in our case, we don't even have the menu of vaccines available to our citizenry. I'm certainly not suggesting anything, but again, we find ourselves looking down the barrel of a gun, and I'm not wanting to be overly dramatic here. But in a situation where people are forced to make a choice and are unwilling to exercise their right to choose, the outcomes invariably are inevitable. Thanks, Double.
Much appreciated there, Anton. All right, Gabriel, where to from here? I mean, what does civil society and affected stakeholders do? I mean, yeah, we remain vigilant. We are watching very carefully. SIU reports, investigations are being done. There seems to be, I don't know, I mean, at this point, no desire to introduce some socially restrictive measures, especially around this festive season. However, we are seeing those numbers escalating, which could have severe impact on the socioeconomic status of the country.
Yeah, I think the most important thing from a media side, from a government regulation side, and really just from an ordinary South African citizen side, is to keep track of the cases and to keep track of the deaths and the hospitalizations. We want to protect our hospital system from being overwhelmed. We want to protect people from being killed. If, as in the UK, you have the cases spiking, but the deaths stay flat, which is currently where they are, but we don't know if they'll stay there. If that's the case, then we must avoid all punitive restrictive measures because they're going to do more harm than good when it comes to livelihoods. If the death numbers come to 5 per million per day, 10 per million per day, 20 per million today, 30 even, like we saw in the third wave, then it does become another story, and thinking about quarantines and so on comes into play. But we're not nearly at that stage, so we need to keep vigilant, and we need to not get too scared when we see the case numbers before we then also look at the hospital and the death numbers. In terms of encouraging people to get vaccinated, I can't say this enough. People that are vulnerable, people that are at risk, and that is most people, really ought to do the smart thing to protect themselves, to reduce their odds of hospitalization and death, and take advantage of that opportunity, even if it's very limited. What the government needs to do is expand. And so civil society is lobbying for those choices to be expanded in terms of the boosters, if you want to, in terms of other options, if you want to, in terms of private companies having more of a role to play to bring it in. In terms of the lockdown measures and the like, we know that other civil society organizations are going after that. But we as the Institute, we are building our case to go to the Concord if need be, to say COVID is going to be around forever. It is, Thabo, unfortunately, it is most likely to outlive you and me. That is what endemic means. It means it sticks around. So if we let go of democracy, if we let go of parliamentary oversights for as long as there's COVID, then we have authorized the death warrant of South African democracy. So we need the government to come to the plate, as they promised they will do, and we respect Lamini Zuma for making that promise. We need to see them come to the party and say, what is it actually on a factual basis that will allow them to say, okay, now we've crossed the threshold, now we can give South Africans the right to choose. If it's a rational standard, we believe we've already crossed that threshold. If it's an irrational standard, then at least we have a standard we can challenge in court. The main problem with the Coronavirus Command Council is it doesn't even explain itself. If it gives reasons, it does it in the media, it says one thing today, the next thing tomorrow. We need hard legal standards so that we can test it properly and legally. And I think that will be the key to unlocking Parliament from the cage that it's currently trapped in and putting it back in a position where it is the representative of the people, where it understands what's going on, it does so on a reasonable basis. And that gives us the best chance to grow our economy. And let's just remember, you know, the deleterious effects of unemployment, the deleterious effects of poverty, it costs lives. Poverty is not just a matter of an inconvenience. It is deadly. If we don't get our economy going again, people are going to start dying in bigger numbers. And even if you look at our excess mortality coming from government statistics during the trough in October and November, even though the COVID cases came down, the excess mortality didn't come down to the usual level, which means it looks like we're already seeing people die at a rate from poverty, from lockdowns and so on, that we didn't see in 2019 or 2018. And that is extremely concerning. So people should be concerned about that. Apply some pressure. I encourage you to sign on to the IRR's petition against the vaccine mandate. You'll see that on our website. And for the freedom to choose. All right. I really do believe that's the way out. That's the IRR position there. I'm sure Dr. Kutsia, of course, from a health professional point of view, yours is vastly different to that. In fact, you would like to see as many people getting vaccinated as possible. So as a determinant, I mean, Gabriel saying that you look at the number of infections versus the number of those who are dying from the infection. From a healthcare perspective, is that the determinant?
Well, that is one of our problems, and from SAMA's side, we have said this right from the beginning with the strict lockdown restrictions that we saw, that your non-communicable diseases, let me speak, your hypertension, your diabetes, your HIV, or you know, all those TB cases we're going to see a huge impact, and it's going to take about 5 years before we will really understand the impact of what the regulations had, or the strict lockdown regulations around it. Then also the fact that a lot of people was not, you know, seen at the clinics, they were not examined. We had, you know, there was a regulation coming out that allowed the pharmacist to, for more than a year, just to prescribe chronic medication. We were up in arms about that because we knew what was going to happen. So that's from SAMA's side and with other groups we fight, and that was we are back now to normal, every 6 months script. To come back to mandatory vaccines, still feel very strongly, if you're a medical doctor or a healthcare worker, in anyone facing public every day treating patients, you have to be vaccinated. You cannot not be vaccinated, because your chances of spreading viruses to those people who didn't come for their vaccines, who didn't come for their chronic disease management. And you imagine how many people you will, as a medical doctor or as a nurse, will in fact, if you are asymptomatic and we know that most viral infections, for the first 2 or 3 days, you are actually asymptomatic. Once if the symptom starts, you're already infected, at least 72 hours before that, a lot of people, and then for at least another 48 hours, you are highly infectious. So, so it's only the correct way to do that. We're not saying mandatory vaccination for the whole of the population. We are saying if you work, especially in healthcare, you have to get vaccinated. The other problem is if you're not vaccinated and you get sick, you get severe disease, we do not have the capacity, we do not have the human resources. If 5 people in a hospital in ICU, working in ICU, get severely infected, who's taking the rest of the workload on them? The other 2 or 3 that was vaccinated. Yeah. So, and we know that the vaccinated people, for now, with Omicron, get mild disease. And however, we also know that currently in the hospitals, 85% plus is unvaccinated. So, people always ask, when are we going to stop the lockdown? And I say, well, once everyone has been vaccinated. But it would also help going forward if there's another form of vaccines, if there's a tablet, or if there's a nasal spray. I know they're working on a nasal spray. If that is there, that would help a lot. So even though we bring a lot of other injectables into the country, it's always a logistic problems around it. And the more vaccines you have in a clinic, with our current infrastructure, the more difficult it becomes to regulate and who's giving what, is the temperatures being adhered to, which bottle has been opened, it becomes, we need to understand also that at the practicality level, what the challenges are there. And therefore, if I'm a pharmaceutical company, I'll go for a tablet. I'll work really very hard to get a tablet on the market. And I think that would actually solve a lot of our problems.
Let's leave it there for now. Appreciate you all for coming. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Gabriel Crafts and Dr. Angelique Kutsi and Anton Arendse, much appreciated. And thank you for your intervention tonight.